We already have several videos talking about the Byzantine Empire, which is really just the continuation of the Roman Empire after its fall, and they even call themselves the Roman Empire. But what I want to do in this video is a bit of a deep dive to make sure we understand the different elements of continuity and change between what we consider the Roman Empire, when it was one unified Western and Eastern Roman Empire, and then what we later call the Byzantine Empire. So what was the same between them? And then what changed over time? So let's just do a review. This is what things look like at around the year 400. As you can see, from an administrative point of view, even though it was considered one empire, it was already being governed separately, the West being governed from Rome, the East being governed from Constantinople. And most historians mark the beginning of the Byzantine Empire with the rule of Constantine, who moves the capital to Byzantium. It gets renamed Constantinople. But as we've talked about in multiple videos, in 476, you have the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and the West becomes fragmented, a bunch of various Germanic kingdoms, but the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, continues. And once again, they did not call themselves the Byzantines. They called themselves the Romans. They called themselves the Roman Empire. It was only much, much later that historians tried to separate this period of the Roman Empire by calling it the Byzantine Empire. There is a bit of a resurgence under Justinian. He's able to capture significant portions of the West, including the Italian peninsula. But then over time, the Byzantine Empire contracts. Especially in the East, it has to contend with the spread of Islam. As we go even further in time, as we enter into the second millennium, we can see that the Muslim Turks make further inroads into the Byzantine Empire. Also during the Fourth Crusades, Western Crusaders sack Constantinople. And we can go all the way to 1453, where all that was left at the time of the Byzantine Empire, or you could say the Eastern Roman Empire, is Constantinople. And in 1453, that also gets sacked by the Ottomans. And that's the official end of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, which you can see continues on for another 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, with that review out of the way, let's think about the main points of continuity and what actually changes. So let's first think about power center. So clearly this is a change, because during most of the Roman state, whether we're talking about the Roman kingdom, republic, or the empire, Rome is the center of power. But once we get to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and this period that we call the Byzantine Empire, even though they refer to themselves as the Romans, the center of power is Constantinople. And most historians put the beginning of the Byzantine Empire when the center of power changes, when Constantine changed the capital to Byzantium, which eventually will be named Constantinople. What about law and governance? Well, there for sure is some continuity. The Justinian Code that we talk about in other videos is for the most part an extension of Roman law. Its main purpose was to make Roman law more consistent and more clear. But there are elements of change. In particular, there are new laws known as the novels, the reformation or the clarification of the old laws. These are also in Latin, while the novels during the Byzantine Empire are in Greek. Now, once you get into the 8th century, you have the Emperor Leo III and his Ecloga, and I'll put this someplace in between. Because once again, it did represent some continuity, some evolution from Roman law, but it also represented change, in particular, much more of a Christian influence. In terms of governance, one could say there's some continuity. For most of the Roman Empire, you have the notion of a province. Now, at the time of Diocletian, which is shortly before the time of Constantine, this gets complicated a bit, where provinces become smaller, then they become part of dioceses, which become part of prefects. But that notion that Diocletian introduces is continuous with the early Byzantine Empire. But as you get to the time of Heraclius, in the early 7th century, he changes the provincial system to what is known as a theme system. And this is essentially a feudal system like we study in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, where the emperor grants land and those who control the land promise military and economic support for the emperor. language definitely represents an element of change here. During most of the history of the Roman Empire centered at Rome, the language was Latin, while once it becomes centered at Constantinople, Greek eventually becomes the official language, and this becomes official under Heraclius in the early 7th century. In terms of religion, during most of the Roman state, the Roman Empire, you have your Roman pantheon, with Jupiter as the head. You also have this notion of a divine emperor. But once you get into the Byzantine Empire, remember, Constantine was the first emperor that eventually converts to Christianity. He legalizes Christianity. Theodosius later makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that's all under the time, even though the Western Roman Empire hadn't fallen as yet. But most historians consider that to be the beginning of the Byzantine Empire. And so this is the Roman pantheon versus Christianity. In terms of culture, there's definitely some points of continuity here. The people we call the Byzantines called themselves Roman. They viewed themselves as the Roman Empire. They also had a lot of the public festivals or public events that we associate with the Roman Empire, things like chariot racing. Justinian was famously almost overthrown during riots after a particularly contentious chariot race. They also did things like public executions and celebrating the emperor's birthday. But there was also some change. For example, Theodosius, who made Christianity the official religion, thought that the Olympic Games was not Christian. And so they ended the Olympic Games, something started by the ancient Greeks. You also saw a lessening of gladiator fights. Some historians would say because of the Christian narrative that started to become part of the Eastern Empire. Some would say that it was no longer an empire of conquest anymore. There was less people to even get as gladiators. And so, once again, this is an overview. I encourage you to think about these things yourself. Do research on your own. Think about what was the same between them, what were elements of continuity, and what were elements of change. But this is a good start to think through.